give the AA floor to talk, and we have met once or twice at things. He will tell you more about himself, because I thought he does know about himself, and I don't. So, over to you.
Thank you. I will try today to explain in my very special French-English language about the restoration of an English-Chinese garden in France, which is never Chinese, nor English, and has in fact no reference with a French classical garden. I must say that at the end of the 18th century, the relationship between France and England was not so good, even in the garden department. So France was refusing to admit that English parks had a real advantage and were pioneers for the picturesque garden and the understanding of a natural landscape. We used to say, at the Prince de Ligne, we should never speak about English gardens, because it's false. It's from the Chinese gardener that we learned everything, English and French. All around the world, we should only speak about Chinese gardens. And it's more or less the same thing when Arthur Young went to France in 1780, and he wrote on his diary, "I went to Versailles in order to visit the Queen's English garden at Trianon. It's a Chinese garden." Anyway, the English-Chinese garden or the picturesque gardens were really fashionable at the end of the 18th century in France. And the most famous was the désert, well known through the description drawings and engraving. And I am very proud to see that on your program you take the engraving of the désert, so everyone knows a little bit about it. The désert excludes the forest of Marly, near Saint-Germain-en-Laye, near Versailles, 20 miles west from Paris. The place has been cultivated since the 12th century by monks coming from Paris and an abbey, the Abbey of Joyenval, founded by Barthélemy de Roy at the 13th century. And the ruins of the Gothic chapel in the desert are a remain of the 13th-14th century chapel of the parish. And you can see this on the map, two sites. At the beginning of the 18th century, the Abbey of Joyenval, the small parish of Retz, and in 1760, the Abbey, and first a formal garden which was existing before. Mr. de Monville bought this area to do his own garden. Garden which is between the forest of Marly and the wood there, the Taille d'Herblay. So it's really a small valley surrounded by old forests everywhere, and it's still now. And if the desert is known, it's because Monville had prints of his garden, and the 13th booklet of Le Rouge is only about the desert. And during 10 to 12 years, Monville tried to make his property bigger, and at the end it was 38 hectares, which is more or less 80 acres, and still it is now. In fact, the desert is a garden, not a park, but its environment could give the impression that it's a park because the space is very open all around. Inside the desert, the natural order is evoked by the design of the winding of the river and the ponds, wooden bridge, and also by the grotto used as the main entrance of the estate from the forest of Mali. The antiquity is symbolized by an obelisk and an Egyptian pyramid. Ancient Greece by the Temple of Peace and the Temple of God Pan. This temple is on the other side of a small valley where stands the broken column, which shows a kind of new interest for the antique ruins. The broken column of the desert is as the testimony of a colossal temple whose first element seems to have been just discovery. When you see the broken column, you have Herculanum, Pompeii, and also the paintings of Hubert Robert very quickly in your mind. This monument, which has no real scale, is a little bit like the remains of the statue of the Emperor Constantine in Rome, and there you are as the painter Fuseli, like a hopeless artist in front of the highness of antiques ruin. China is also very present at the desert. There is not only a Chinese house, but also a Chinese garden and greenhouses, gates with poles and bells. All this area is decorated with vases and Chinese human figures. I must say that today in France we have the sale of the Château de Grousset, and when I am speaking, I think the vase of the Tartar tent are sale. I expect that I will maybe buy it to put once day at the desert, but it's difficult to have a telephone and make auction during your lecture, so I gave an order, but I expect maybe once this vase will come back, will be at the desert. On the island of the Happiness was built a Tartar tent, memory of a far-away country. The theater is at the bottom of the valley and can use the folly as scenery. The people, musicians, actors, and spectators were staying all together on stage. Not far from the theater stands up the small altar, partially ruined, which is visible from the Mr. de Monville bedroom. And next to the farms are the remains of the parish old Gothic chapel. The organization of the folly all around the small valley is very harmonious. In fact, if you are there at the column, you see the pyramid, you see the grotto, Temple of Pan, Chinese house, theater, and Tartar tent. Greenhouses are there. So in this part you have the main follies. But on the other part, because the column is a kind of a crest, you have all the agricultural part with the farm, the milk house, and the kitchen garden. So the column is the center of the garden composition, looking in all directions: history, philosophy, geography, and agriculture. By a very clever use of the ground, Mr. de Monville has been able to put his follies, 17, on a very small space and without being too close and fighting each other. But that was not really the opinion of a Scottish gardener, Thomas Blakey. He wrote, "The Duke of Orleans had many of those pretended connoisseurs in everything about him as Mr. de Monville. He had formed a garden and patch according to his own designs adjacent to the forest of Marly, where he had made his chateau in form of an old round tower with a stair in the middle surrounded by flower pots, which made a tolerable, agreeable effect. He had also some good hot houses, and by them he had a little Chinese building where he generally lodged. The whole of the park was a labyrinth of rather narrow, crooked walks without forming many agreeable landscapes. The entry was rather an arch of triumph of Gothic building. On the left, upon the rising ground, stood a small temple in the Doric taste. The tower formed another, but too confined. I must say there was a sort of competition between Blakey, the Scottish gardener of the Duke of Orleans, and Mr. de Monville, the connoisseur. He had designed, Monville, for the Duke's grottos and greenhouses in his garden at Monceau in Paris. Maybe Blakey's opinion was more true at the beginning of the desert, when the trees did not have their adult size. But with the time and the disappearance of quite a few follies, it's not true anymore. The Prince de Ligne, the great amateur of this kind of garden, wrote about the desert in 1782. A lot of earth movement is existing in and around the garden. Everything is picturesque, even the gate of the park, which is of a great effect. The first scene drives you to other scenes that you are unable to see at the same time. From only one temple built on the top of a ravine without affectation, in front of the forest, which have a view on different points. The temple is looking in all directions and is seen as a decoration from everywhere. In 1785, 17 follies were existing. Nowadays, there are less than 10, and they are partly restored. But 200 years after the desert was created by Mr. de Monville, the garden is still its first limits. The environment of the desert is still natural, and I think that it's the only case so close to Paris, and I must say that Mr. de Monville's choice was a good one when he decided to live at the desert. Very curiously, his first house at the desert was a Chinese house, the first one built in Europe, if you don't take care, the house of Confucius at Kew, into account, house which was only the name of a house. The exercise done by Mr. de Monville was so good that he received congratulations from the Prince de Ligne. The Emperor of China should be very happy about the small Chinese house of Mr. de Monville, which is a model of invention. Of course, the Chinese house of the desert is not a real copy of a Chinese house, but through the books of Chambers, the amateurs had better information. But still Mr. de Monville was far away from an archaeologic or ethnologic reality. On the roof, you have slates and not tiles, and inside there is a floor à la Versailles and not some Chinese mats. The drawing room is more looking like a Parisian boudoir with its oriental alcove and French windows. But in spite of this significant difference, the Chinese presence can be easily noted with the post, imitation of bamboo, you can see there. The light, the shape of the roof of the chimney, which you see the smoke passing through the vase. And you have also Chinese person even on the roof. And of course, all around, you had vase, as I say, a little bit before. The second house, Mr. de Monville's second house at the Désert, was the broken column built in 1781-1782. It's like a ruin which has been recently discovered. The base of the column of 15 meters diameter is seen only on a quarter. The pedestal is partially destroyed by false cracks at the column itself. In each flute, you have French windows, square windows, œil de bœuf, and cracks coming from the ruined top, which in fact you have windows in it which permit to have the light at the upper level. And so the roof is masked by the walls, and you have light coming inside the staircase, and between each post of the staircase you have flowers. So you have also the nature inside the column, and in each room you have quite a lot of mirrors which reflect the landscape. That just show you quickly the plan, the inside plan, the ground floor, and the first level, the second level. Ground floor is a very nice classical plan which inspired Thomas Jefferson for his first sketch of the capital of Washington, and also for the University of Virginia, the library. But I have to speak more about the park than about the architecture, but as an architect, I speak first about architecture, but I think also in this kind of garden, the architecture is very present, so you have to speak a little bit about it. Mr. de Monville spent about 15 years at the Désert, receiving the French court, Queen Marie Antoinette, Gustave III, King of Sweden, the Prince de Ligne, the Duke d'Orléans, and Thomas Jefferson and Maria Cosway. He also received painters as Hubert Robert and Madame Vigier-Lebrun. She came with one of his old friends, the Comtesse du Barry. Madame de Monville, Monsieur de Monville also received writers, poets, and musicians. Mr. de Monville was, with Beaumarchais, one of the first harpists in France, playing with Gluck and the Comtesse de Genlis. In 1782, Mr. de Monville decided to sell his two-mansion house in Paris, built by the great architect Boullé, and the Désert. The new owner of all his property is an Englishman, Lewis Disney Fitch. It seems that this Englishman traveling in France for the education of his daughters, really appreciated the desert and its Chinese-English garden. But unfortunately, Lewis Disney Fitch will very quickly have a lot of difficulties. First, he was noble. Second point, he was English, and he had been obliged very quickly to immigrate in 1783, 6 months after he bought the desert. And then the desert had a seizure on everything. List, estimation are organized, and sales of the furniture are done in Saint-Germain-en-Laye. The best of the plants are sent to the King's Garden, called then the National Museum, and now le Jardin des Plantes. The desert is first rented and then sold in 1811. By chance, the new owner was not able to pay, and Lewis Disney Fitch had in 1817 the desert back 25 years after he had bought it. The archive of the Revolution period have been of a great utility for the history of the desert, because Mr. de Monville in 1782 sold the house with all the furniture. We were also lucky to find the inventory of Mr. de Monville after his death in Paris in 1797. The desert passed through the French Revolution, the Empire, without too much damage, as you can see through the engraving of Laborde, which served for the program of your conference. But looking to the plan, you see that all this part has been changed and come back to agriculture, and you see also that the layout of the kitchen garden has been changed a little bit. But this part is in good condition. After different owners, the desert belongs to the family of Frederick Passi, the first Nobel Prize for Peace in 1901, and his family got the desert from 1856 to 1936. The Passi family restored the garden very well and planted most of the trees we can see now. And that's the first photograph of the broken column made by the owner just before Passi, and I have the chance to find these documents on the livre d'or of this family. In these two photos from 1901, you see that the English-Chinese garden, which has been simplified during the French Revolution, is then restored more like an English park. The spaces are much more open, and Paul Passi introduced animals inside the garden and create a modern farm with battery rear English end. His wife was English and appreciate the desert. So at the end, I think that the English has been more often in the desert than the French one. That's the pleasure to work on this subject. Rare trees are planted as sequoia around 1880 at a place that Mr. de Monville would have certainly appreciated. Passi makes hay on the open space and plants trees for its own pleasure as cedar, blue cedar, plane trees, purple beech, Taxodium disticum, and so on. They are planted in front of the wooden area or as small group like the Camisci Paris. Unfortunately, the Passi family had not exactly the same good taste for the building and changed the aspect of the column. The broken column of the desert is not the folly of an handsome man anymore, but the house of a numerous family who do not really appreciate the false cracks of Montville. So they change the top of the column, put new windows and chimney on the top too. And you have a drawing there of the drawing room, which look exactly like a famille bourgeoise salon. And these drawings are coming from England, because Peter Dineley gave me the authorization to make a copy of this sketch, which has been done by his grandmother. These drawings were done in April '94, and I think it's the first time that I show them to the public. So it's very interesting to have these drawings, because this makes, again, more information about the desert. And you see there a drawing of the Chinese house on the inside of the Chinese house with the parquet à la Versailles. After the war, the First World War, the life starts to be difficult at the desert. There is photos from 1925. And the Passi family just tried to maintain, but it was not anymore possible after the international crisis, and at the worst period, in 1936, the Passi family is obliged to sell. The situation at the desert is rather bad, but it's not yet disastrous. The disaster comes with the new owner, who has no taste at all and no interest for the desert. He just bought the desert because it's next to his Château de Joyenval, built on the site of the Abbey, and because he had 270 hectares around the desert. The French writer Colette will fight with the well-known architect Jean-Charles Moreau in order to obtain the protection for historical monument about the desert. The owner refused, and very slowly, in this very difficult period, the protection of the desert was acted. It's more or less the first decision driving to a future restoration. And this is two nice watercolors of Jean-Charles Moreau of the Chinese house on the column. In 1938, that's the period I call a passive period of restoration. In 1938, the desert is protected as historical site, and this protection can be delivered then without the agreement of the owner. The 9th of April 1941, the desert is protected as historical monument without the agreement of the owner by decision of Maréchal Pétain, with the agreement of our Conseil d'État or highest court, which is absolutely necessary in such a procedure. Of course, nothing has been done during the last war, and the follies of the desert start to be vandalized and some trees cut for personal use during frosty period of the last war. So there you can see the Chinese house around 1950. After the war, the importance of the desert was not so evident for the French administration. Too many cathedrals need restoration, and the credits, which were never enough, were mainly directed to the public historical monuments. Restoring an English-Chinese garden was not a priority when so many owners and cities claim for help about their monument. Just after the war, an English family, again, was interested to buy the desert. It's the family of Lady Cooper, the wife of the ambassador of England in France. She tried to get it, but the owner refused because he was expecting that at the end that the French administration of fine arts will take off the protection if the monuments were in very bad condition. The desert was then very close to a complete destruction, even if sometimes intellectuals or writers was wondering about it. And I found this article from Nancy Mitford, who wrote in the Sunday Time in November 1950. How can something which is classy be allowed to moulder away so tragically? However, it seems that will the owner of a monument classé historique is forbidden to pull it down or alter in any way, he cannot be forced to keep it in repair. The Surrealist group went also at the desert during this period and were quite subjugate. They took photos but did nothing else. And you can see there at the middle André Breton, and there they are with masks in front of the gate of the desert. The restoration of such a place was not so evident, and even the writer Colette wrote, "But because I knew the desert on a stormy day of June, I am anxious to see the place change, built again from its ruins, and soon too new and too clean." It was 60 years ago, in 1938. 25 years later, in 1963, I went to the desert for the first time, and it was really a huge shock for the student in architecture I was, and from this day, I start to be sure that I will be once an architect, an historian of architecture, and also the historian of the desert. The desert was really then a jungle, with from place to place piece of monuments fighting against vegetation on their own